London, 1819. The first snow of December had begun to fall over Harrow Lane when Eloise Merritt decided, with the quiet finality of a woman who had run out of patience, that she would never open another letter bearing the Ashcombe seal. She held the envelope between her fingers as though it were something already dead. The wax was heavy, a deep winter red, stamped with a crest she had known since girlhood, a falcon in flight above a crown of laurel. 3 months ago, the sight of that crest might have stopped her breath. 6 months ago, it might have cracked her open. But on this pale morning, with frost creeping along the edges of her window pane and her small fire struggling to survive in the grate, Eloise felt nothing but the cold weight of something she had already mourned. She did not break the seal. She did not smooth the parchment. She did not hold it to the lamplight to guess at the shape of his hand. She simply turned it over, took her pen, and wrote across the front in a steady, unhurried script returned to sender. No longer at this address. And then, because pride demanded it, she added beneath in a smaller hand, though we both know that is not the truth. She handed the letter to Mrs. Finch, the widow who kept house for her, with instructions that it be given to the first post rider leaving Harrow Lane at dawn. Mrs. Finch, who had not been told much but who had guessed a great deal, took the letter without comment. The older woman's mouth tightened, the way it always did when she disapproved without wishing to say so, and then she nodded once and disappeared down the narrow staircase. Eloise stood in the silence she had left behind and pressed her palms flat against the table until the trembling stopped. She had lived in this rented cottage for nearly 2 years. She had chosen it for its distance from London, for the way the lane ended in a copse of birches that hid the house from the road, for the fact that no one who had known her in the life before would ever think to look for her here. She had built this quiet around herself the way a wounded animal builds a nest not from comfort, but from necessity. And now, with a single returned letter, she had drawn a line across that quiet and dared the world to cross it. She did not truly believe he would come. That was what she told herself as she moved through the rest of the morning. She told herself as she mended a tear in the hem of her gray day dress. She told herself as she measured out the last of the tea and decided she would have to make the journey into the village before the week was out. She told herself as she sat by the window with a book of poetry open in her lap, reading the same lines 7 times without understanding a word. Dukes did not chase women who had refused them. Dukes did not ride through snow to cottages at the end of forgotten lanes. Dukes married, and grieved, and moved on, and became the sort of men their fathers had been before them. That was the order of things. That was how the world worked for men like Julian Hartley, 6th Duke of Ashcombe. That was how it had worked even when he had said, a lifetime ago in a garden she refused to let herself remember, that he was not that kind of man. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She was 23 years old, and she had once been the kind of woman who kept count of seasons and suitors and the small victories of a well-turned phrase at a dinner table. She had been the daughter of Sir Reginald Merritt, a country baronet whose estate in Hertfordshire had been modest but respectable, and whose library had given her the only fortune she had ever wanted. She had grown up reading Shakespeare aloud to her father in the evenings, translating passages of Italian for his amusement, arguing with his friends about whether Miss Austen's novels were merely entertainment or something finer. Her mother had died when Eloise was 9, and her father had raised her with the distracted tenderness of a man who did not know how to be both parents at once, and so tried to be one very well. She had adored him. When he had died of a fever the winter she turned 19, she had not eaten for 3 days. And when the letter had come from his solicitor informing her that the estate was entailed upon a cousin she had never met, and that she would have 6 months to remove herself from the only home she had ever known, she had discovered that grief and dispossession could wear the same face. That was how she had come to London in the spring of her 20th year, with a modest inheritance from her mother and a letter of introduction to her father's cousin Lady Harriet Penrose. That was how, for one brief and glittering season, she had been a young woman with prospects and wit and a quiet sort of beauty that certain men noticed and certain others did not. And that was how, on a night in May when the hawthorn was in bloom and the air had smelled of rain and lilies, she had met the man she had spent the last 2 years trying to forget. But Eloise did not let herself think of that night. She had trained herself, as one trains a dog or a temper, to turn her mind aside whenever it drifted toward the memory. She had built routines around the avoidance. She rose at 7. She drank her tea. She read for an hour. She walked the lane whether it snowed or shone. She ate a small supper. She wrote in a journal she never reread. She slept, or she lay awake. And when the sleepless nights came too often, she drank a small glass of brandy Mrs. Finch kept for the purpose and did not let herself cry. She had made a life of small, controlled motions, and it had almost begun to feel like peace. Almost. 40 miles to the east, in a great house of pale stone that rose from the Hertfordshire hills like something carved out of the century before, Julian Hartley, 6th Duke of Ashcombe, sat alone in the library of Ashcombe Court and read the returned letter twice. He read it first as a man of title and consequence, with the cool detachment he had been raised to wear like a second skin. He read it the second time as a man who had not slept properly in nearly a year. The handwriting was hers. He would have known it anywhere. The downward slope of the R, the small flourish on the final letter of address, the fact that she had written through the wax rather than breaking it, all of it was Eloise, unmistakable and precise, and every line of it was a door she had shut in his face. He was 32 years old. He had been the Duke of Ashcombe for 9 of those years. Since the winter he was 23, and his father had died of an apoplexy in this very room, in a chair by this very window, without warning and without a last word to anyone who loved him. He had inherited the title and the estate and the political weight of a family that had sat in Parliament for 4 generations. He had inherited the expectation that he would marry well and soon, and a woman of appropriate rank. He had inherited a mother whose grief had curdled into ambition, and a younger sister whose spirit was too bright to be extinguished by either. He had inherited, in short, everything that a man of his standing was supposed to inherit, and he had discovered within a year that none of it had prepared him to be alone. He was not, by reputation, a cruel man, nor was he, by reputation, a warm one. The Ton called him the Stone Duke behind his back and, in later years, occasionally to his face. It was said that he had not smiled at a ball in 5 seasons. It was said that he had broken the hearts of 3 debutantes without ever having spoken more than civilities to any of them. It was said that he ran his estates with a precision that his tenants respected and his peers resented, and that he spoke in the House of Lords only when he had something worth saying, which made the occasions rare and the effect considerable. All of these things were true, and none of them were the whole truth, which was that he had built his reserve around a wound he had never allowed anyone to see, and he had built it so carefully that even he had begun to forget where the wound lay. Except that he had not forgotten. He had simply been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for something to remind him. That something had arrived in the spring of 1817, at a ball in the Penrose house in Grosvenor Square, in the person of a young woman he had no particular reason to notice. She had been standing at the edge of the ballroom when he saw her, half hidden by a column, holding a glass of lemonade. She was plainly not drinking and watching the dancers with an expression that struck him as unusual. Not the longing of a wallflower, not the calculation of a fortune hunter, not the boredom of a young woman who had been out too many seasons. Something else, something like amusement held in check, something like a private conversation she was having with herself about the people in the room, and he had wanted, with an intensity that had startled him, to know what she was thinking. He had crossed the room before he could think better of it. He had introduced himself with a bow and a single line of formality, and she had looked up at him, met his eyes, and said, "I had been wondering, Your Grace, whether you ever spoke in drawing-rooms, or only in Parliament." I had begun to suspect the latter. He had laughed. It had been the first time he had laughed in public in almost 4 years. That had been the beginning. What followed had been 3 months of careful, deliberate courtship walks in the park that happened to coincide. Conversations in Lady Penrose's drawing-room that happened to last too long. A slow and reluctant understanding on both sides that something had occurred between them which neither of them had quite meant to allow. He had not proposed. He had told himself he was waiting for the right moment, and he had been, in part. But the larger truth was that he had been afraid. Not of her, of what his mother would say, of the season his sister was about to enter, of the political alliance his family had been quietly arranging with the Marquis of Tollesbury for nearly a year, of the fact that Eloise Merritt, however clever and however beloved by her late father, was the orphan daughter of a country baronet with no fortune and no connections, and that marrying her would cost him in ways he was not certain he had the courage to pay. So he had waited. He had said nothing. And on a night in August, at a garden party in Richmond, he had allowed his mother to announce, in the hearing of 300 people, that the Duke of Ashcombe was to be congratulated upon his engagement to Lady Cordelia Tollesbury. He had not been engaged to Lady Cordelia, not in any formal sense. His mother had arranged the announcement without consulting him, in a desperate gamble to force his hand before he ruined himself upon an unsuitable attachment. He had stood there in the lantern-lit garden, with Eloise not 10 feet away on the arm of Lady Penrose, and he had seen her face change. He had seen the color drain from her cheeks. He had seen her understand, in one merciless instant, what his silence had meant. And when he had gone to her the next morning, to explain, to deny, to beg for a chance, the butler at the Penrose house had informed him with cold civility that Miss Merritt was not receiving callers, and would not be receiving callers, and had left Grosvenor Square by the early coach. He had written to her. He had written to her every week for 6 months, and every letter had been returned unopened, and eventually Lady Penrose had sent him a single line informing him that she did not know where Eloise had gone and would not tell him if she did, and that she believed he had done quite enough damage for one lifetime. He had, in the end, broken off the unspoken understanding with the Tollesburys. His mother had not forgiven him. Lady Cordelia had married a baronet within the year and, by all accounts, was perfectly content. He had thrown himself into the work of the estate and the work of the lords, and he had told himself that the ache in his chest would fade, as all aches did, and that a man who had survived the death of a father and the loss of a way of life could certainly survive the loss of a woman he had known for 3 months. He had told himself this for nearly 2 years. He had almost believed it. And then, a fortnight ago, on a wet afternoon in a coffee house in Cheapside, he had overheard a solicitor's clerk mentioning a cottage at the end of a lane in Harrow, and the name of the tenant had been Merritt. He had gone home. He had sat in this chair. He had written a letter in which he had tried, and failed, and tried again, to say what he had been unable to say for 2 years. He had sent it yesterday morning. And this morning, before he had even finished his first cup of coffee, it had come back to him with her handwriting across the front and a single sentence that had cracked the careful silence of 2 years and a half. Though we both know that is not the truth. Julian Hartley set the letter down on the desk. He rose. He walked to the window and stood looking out at the snow falling over the park, and for a long moment he did not move. Then he turned and rang the bell. His valet appeared within the minute, as he always did, and found his master already pulling a traveling coat from the cupboard. "Have the gray mare saddled," Julian said, "and tell Thomas to prepare the small carriage behind. I will ride ahead. Tonight, your grace?" The valet, who had served him for 11 years and had learned to ask questions only when they were necessary, blinked once. "Now," Julian said. "I ride now." "To where, your grace?" Julian looked at the letter on the desk, at the handwriting that had cut him open cleanly in his own library, at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, with the snow falling. "To Harrow Lane," he said quietly, "to ask a woman why she returned my letter." The valet bowed and withdrew. The fire cracked in the grate. Julian stood for one more moment in the library that had been his father's and was now his own, and he felt, for the first time in 2 years, the strange and terrible lightness of a man who has decided to do something he should have done long ago, and who no longer cares what it will cost him. He was in the saddle within the hour. The sky had darkened by the time he reached the edge of the Ashcombe estate, and the snow was falling in earnest, thick white flakes that clung to the mare's mane and melted on the shoulders of his coat. He rode south through the fields, through a country road that became a lane and then a track, and the light drained out of the afternoon the way color drains from a painting left too long in the sun. He did not stop at the inn at Barnet, though he might have. He did not stop at the coaching post at Hatfield, though the mare was tired and he was colder than he had been in years. He rode through the falling snow with the collar of his coat turned up against the wind, and he thought of nothing in particular and of one thing entirely, which was the line of handwriting on the front of the letter and the woman who had written it. He did not know what he would say when he reached her door. He knew only that he had allowed silence to speak for him once before, and that silence had cost him the only thing he had ever truly wanted, and that he would not make that mistake a second time even if it ruined him. By the time the small wooden sign for Harrow Lane appeared out of the gray of the afternoon, the world had narrowed to the sound of the mare's breathing and the crunch of hoof on packed snow. He slowed. He had not planned for what came next. He realized, with a quiet and bitter amusement, that he had ridden 40 miles in a December storm without the faintest notion of what he meant to do when he arrived. He turned the mare into the lane. The copse of birches closed around him. The light was almost gone, and at the end of the track, half hidden behind a low stone wall and a wicket gate, he saw the cottage. It was smaller than he had imagined. A single story, with a thatched roof and one smoking chimney, and a narrow path that had been shoveled clean of snow that morning and was now filling again. A lamp burned in the front window, warm and yellow against the blue dusk, and behind that lamp, through the wavy glass, he could see the shape of a woman seated at a table with her head bent over a book. Julian dismounted. He tied the mare to the gate. He stood for a long moment in the falling snow and looked at the lit window, and he felt the cold go through his coat and into his bones, and he did not move. He had crossed 40 miles, and he could not cross the last 20 yards. He did not know why. He knew only that the woman at the table in the window had built this quiet around herself for 2 years because of what he had failed to say, and that whatever he said now would either begin something or end it for good, and there would be no third chance. He walked up the path. The snow crunched under his boots. He reached the door. He lifted his hand, and he waited, and then he knocked 3 times, even, and not too loud, the way his father had taught him to knock when he was a boy. The light in the window did not move for a long moment. Then he heard a chair slide back. He heard footsteps cross a wooden floor. He heard a bolt drawn, and another, and the small domestic sound of a latch being lifted. And then the door opened a hand's breadth, and Eloise Merritt stood on the other side of it with a candle in her hand and an expression that he would remember, afterward, as the exact shape of the moment his life divided into what had come before and what would come after. She did not scream. She did not gasp. She did not slam the door. She simply stood there, with the candlelight falling across one side of her face and the dusk behind him, and she looked at him the way a person looks at a ghost they have been half expecting for a long time. She was thinner than he remembered. Her hair was down, caught loosely at the nape of her neck, and she was wearing a gray dress he had never seen her in. Her eyes were the same, gray and steady and startlingly intelligent, and, at this moment, full of something he could not read. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was quiet. It did not shake. "You are on my doorstep, in the snow, before sunrise." He realized, absurdly, that she was right. The gray of the sky had been dusk when he turned into the lane, but it was not dusk any longer. It was the first colorless hour before dawn, and he had ridden through the night without knowing it. He had stood at her gate for longer than he had realized. "Yes," he said. "Why?" "Because you returned my letter. I have been returning your letters for 2 years. You have never written on the front of one before." Her hand tightened on the edge of the door. The candle guttered and steadied. She did not speak for a moment, and he watched her face, and he was almost sure he saw something flicker there that was not quite anger, and not quite grief, and not quite hope, but something made of all 3 at once. "Go home, Your Grace," she said finally. Her voice was very soft. "Whatever you came to say, I do not want to hear it. Go home before the snow gets worse." "I will not," he said. She stared at him. "I will not go home," he said again, and he heard his own voice, and it was steadier than he had felt in a year. "I have ridden 40 miles through a storm to ask you one question. You may shut the door in my face. You may leave me to freeze on your step. You may send word to the magistrate, if you wish. But I will not leave this place until you have answered me. And if you make me wait until the sun is up, then I will wait until the sun is up." "What question?" she whispered. He met her eyes. The candlelight trembled between them. "Why?" he said. "Did you write that last line?" And Eloise Merritt, who had taught herself in 2 years of careful solitude never to let her hands shake in the presence of a man, looked down at the candle in her fist and saw the flame wavering, and understood, with something very close to despair, that the quiet she had built was already gone. She did not answer him at once. She stood in the gap of the door with the candle trembling in her hand, and she looked at the man on her step as though he were a problem in arithmetic she had thought she had solved and now found, to her quiet horror, that she had not. The wind lifted a strand of hair from her temple. The snow caught in the folds of his coat and did not melt. He was waiting. He had said he would wait, and she understood, with a sinking certainty, that he meant it. Julian Hartley had always meant the things he said. That had been half the trouble. The other half had been the things he had not said at all. "You will freeze," she said at last. "Then let me freeze." "Do not be absurd, Your Grace." "I am past absurdity, Miss Merritt. I passed it somewhere near the 10th mile." She closed her eyes for one beat, two, and when she opened them she had made the decision she had been trying not to make. She stepped back from the door. She did not invite him in with words. She only moved aside by half a pace, and tilted her chin the smallest fraction, and let the gesture speak for her. He understood. He stepped across the threshold, and the snow came with him on his boots and on his shoulders, and he stood in her small front room with his hat in his hand, and looked around as though he were trying to memorize the shape of the place she had built without him. It was not a fine room. The plaster on the ceiling had a crack she had never been able to afford to mend. The rug had been worn pale by her own pacing. A single shelf held the books she had salvaged from her father's library, 24 of them at most, arranged by the alphabet he had taught her as a child. A writing desk stood beneath the window. A small fire struggled in the grate, and above the mantel there hung a watercolor of a field at Hertfordshire in summer, which she had painted herself, badly, when she was 15. He looked at it all. He did not speak, and when his eyes came back to her face she saw, with something close to panic, that he had understood every item on the shelf, that he had read her 2 years in one slow sweep, and that he knew precisely what she had been doing with them. "Sit down," she said. Her voice surprised her by being steady. "I will not have you standing in a puddle of snow in my parlor. There is a chair by the fire." "I did not come to sit." "You came to ask me a question, Your Grace. You may ask it from the chair." He looked at her for another moment, and then he laughed a single soft breath of a laugh, the kind that escapes a man who has forgotten the sound of his own amusement and is startled to find it still there. He removed his coat. He hung it over the back of the chair. He sat down. The fire lit one side of his face and left the other in shadow, and Eloise saw, with a pang she did not permit herself to examine, that he had aged. Not by much, but the line beside his mouth was deeper than she remembered, and there was a thread of gray at his temple that had not been there 2 years ago, and he looked like a man who had not slept well in a long time. She did not sit. She set the candle on the table. She went to the grate and added a log to the fire, not for his comfort, she told herself, but for the simple reason that the room was cold, and she did not intend to freeze in her own parlor for the sake of pride. She stood with her back to him for a moment longer than was necessary. She straightened. She turned. "Ask then," she said. "Why did you write that line?" "I have told you. Go home." "Eloise." She flinched. He had not used her given name in 2 years. She had not heard it from any voice but her own in the silence of this cottage, and the sound of it in his mouth, low and careful, was more of an assault than anything he could have said in anger. She turned her face away. "You do not have that name anymore," she said quietly. "You gave it up." "I never gave it up. I was cowardly, and I was slow, and I was afraid of my mother, and I allowed a silence to grow between us that I should have broken with the first word she spoke in that garden. But I did not give you up, Eloise. I have never given you up. I have only been trying to find the way back to you, and I have been failing, and this morning your letter told me that I was failing for a reason I had not understood." "And what reason is that?" "That you had not stopped reading them." She went still. She did not turn. She felt the truth of the sentence land somewhere beneath her ribs and settle there, and she understood, with a small, terrible clarity, that she had given herself away the moment she had taken up her pen and written across the front of the envelope. A woman who had stopped caring would not have written anything. A woman who had truly closed the door would have let the letter go back in silence, unmarked, unanswered, a dead thing returning to a dead place. But she had written. She had written 8 words, and the last 4 of them had been a confession she had not meant to make, and he had ridden 40 miles through a snowstorm because he had read them correctly. "Leave," she whispered. "Eloise, look at me." "I cannot." "Look at me." She turned. She did not know how. Her body obeyed him before her mind had finished refusing, and when her eyes met his across the small firelit room, she saw that he was not the stone duke that London whispered about. He was a man sitting in a chair in her parlor with snow melting in his hair, and he was looking at her as though she were the only thing in the room, the only thing in the county, the only thing he had come for in 2 years of silence. And she understood, with a slow and awful honesty, that she had never stopped loving him. She had only stopped speaking of it, which was not the same thing. "I wrote that line," she said, and her voice was not quite her own, "because I am tired. I am tired, Your Grace. I have been tired for 2 years. I have built this life with my own hands, a room at a time, a habit at a time, and I have made myself a person who can rise in the morning and read a book and walk a lane and go to sleep again without weeping. And this morning your letter came, and I looked at the seal, and I felt the whole of it begin to crack, and I could not bear it. So I wrote those 4 words because I wanted you to know, just once, that I had not forgotten. And then I wanted you to leave me alone. I cannot leave you alone. You must. I will not. Julian." It was her turn to say his name, and she had not meant to, and the moment it left her mouth, she saw him close his eyes. He sat very still in the chair. He did not speak for a long breath. When he opened his eyes again, they were wet, though no tears fell, and Eloise felt her own careful composure begin to fracture along a line she had thought was stronger than this. "Say it again," he said. "No. Once. Only once. And then I will do whatever you ask." She pressed her fist against her mouth. She shook her head. She was going to cry, and she had not cried in front of another human being in 2 years, and she would not do it now, not for him, not after everything she had built. She turned her face to the fire. The wood popped. The silence in the room was full of things neither of them had yet said, and after a long moment, she heard him stand. She heard him cross the room. She did not turn. He stopped an arm's length behind her, close enough that she could feel the cold still rising from his clothes. And he did not touch her, and he did not speak, and for a moment the whole of the 2 years she had spent in this cottage seemed to gather itself into the space between his hand and her shoulder, and she knew that if he closed that space, she would not survive it. He did not close it. "I will go," he said quietly. "For now, I will take a room at the inn at Barnet. I will come back at noon. If you tell me then, in daylight, with the snow stopped and the fire burning, that you want me to go and not return, I will go and I will not return. I swear it. But I will not ride away from this door in the dark and let you tell yourself that I left because you did not matter. That is the one thing I will not permit. That is not your decision. No, it is mine to offer. It is yours to take." She did not turn. She heard him take up his coat from the chair. She heard him cross to the door. She heard him pause there, with his hand on the latch, and she thought she might speak, and she did not. And after a long moment the door opened and closed, and she was alone again in the parlor with the fire and the candle and the weight of her own returning breath. She did not sleep. She did not try to. She sat in the chair he had sat in, and she felt the lingering warmth of him in the wool of the cushion, and she watched the snow fall through the window until the sky began to turn the color of pearl. Mrs. Finch came down at 6:30 and did not ask why the front room smelled faintly of a wet wool coat and horse, and Eloise was grateful for it. She drank a cup of tea. She did not eat. She stood at the window and watched the lane, and at 1:15, before the sun had fully cleared the birches, she saw the gray mare turn in at the gate. He came to the door in a clean shirt. He had shaved. He had not slept either. She could see it in the set of his jaw, but he had taken the trouble to make himself presentable, and she understood that this was a courtesy he was paying her, and she did not know whether to be touched or furious, and so she was both. She opened the door herself. She did not pretend surprise. "Come in, Your Grace." "Julian." "Come in, Julian." He came in. He did not sit this time. He stood in the center of the small room with his hat in his hand, and he looked at her, and he waited. "I have thought about it," she said. "Yes. I cannot give you the answer you want." Something flickered across his face and did not leave. "I do not mean," she said quickly, "that I want you to go. I mean that I cannot give you an answer at all. Not today. Not in an hour. I am not the woman you knew in Grosvenor Square, Julian. I am not a girl at a ball with a lemonade in her hand. I am a woman who has been alone for 2 years, and I have learned things about myself that I do not yet know how to explain. If you had come to me a year ago, I would have turned you away and called it pride. If you had come 6 months ago, I would have let you in and called it weakness. I do not know what this is. I only know that I cannot decide the rest of my life in a morning, and I will not be rushed into it because you rode through a snowstorm. I am not asking you to decide the rest of your life. What are you asking then?" He was quiet for a long moment. She watched him weigh the words. "I am asking," he said, "for permission to know you again. As you are now, not as you were. I am not asking for a promise. I am not asking for a hand. I am asking you to let me come back to this cottage, on days you choose, for as long as it takes, until one of us knows what this is. And if at the end of it you tell me that you do not want me, I will accept it. But I will not accept it on the strength of a silence 2 years old. She stared at him. She had braced herself for a proposal. She had braced herself for a scene. She had not braced herself for patience, and it undid her in a way that neither of the other things could have. That is not how dukes court women, she said. I am aware. Your mother will be furious. My mother has been furious for 2 years. I have grown accustomed to it. The ton will talk. The ton has been talking about me since I was 19. I no longer hear them. Julian, Eloise. Say yes or say no. I will abide by either. She looked at him. She looked past him at the small parlor she had built from 2 years of careful nothing, at the watercolor above the mantel and the worn rug and the books on the shelf, and she thought, for one dizzy moment, of all the things she had taught herself to want by teaching herself to want nothing. And she understood that the quiet she had built had not been a life. It had been a waiting room. She had been sitting in it for 2 years without admitting it, and she had written 8 words across the front of an envelope because some part of her had finally grown tired of the waiting. Yes, she said. She did not know, in the instant she spoke, what she had said yes to. She only knew that her voice had moved ahead of her thought, and that Julian had heard it, and that the change in his face was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life, whether she meant to or not. He did not cross the room. He did not touch her. He simply inclined his head, the old courtly bow of a man who had been raised to know that consent was a fragile thing, and he said, very quietly, "Thank you. Do not thank me yet. I will thank you now. I will thank you later, as well." She almost laughed. She almost wept. She did neither. "You may come on Thursday," she said, "for an hour. No longer. And you will take tea with me in this parlor, and you will not speak of the past, and you will not speak of the future, and we will discover whether we can bear one another's company in the present. That is all I can offer. That is more than I hoped for. Then go home, Julian, before my neighbors see your horse." He went. She stood at the window and watched him ride back down the lane, and she did not move from the glass until the gray mare had passed the birches and disappeared into the country beyond them. And then she sat down in the chair by the fire and did, finally, quietly, what she had not permitted herself to do in 2 years. She wept. She wept for a long time. She did not feel better afterward. But she did feel, for the first time since she had come to Harrow Lane, that she was alive. He came on Thursday, and on the Thursday after, and on the Tuesday that followed. The snow held, and then it broke, and then it came again in a second storm harder than the first. He never stayed longer than the hour she had granted him. He never pressed for more. He came into the parlor with his hat in his hand, and he drank her tea, which was not good, and he did not mention that it was not good, and he spoke of books and of his sister Henrietta, who was 17 and, he said, the only member of his family who had not yet disappointed him. He asked Eloise, on the 3rd visit, what she was reading, and when she told him it was a volume of Cooper he had owned as a boy, he said nothing for a moment, and then he asked if he might borrow it when she had finished. It was the smallest thing. It was the first thing in 2 years that had made her feel like a person whose reading mattered to someone. She lent him the book. She did not sleep well that night for thinking of it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. By the 5th visit, she had begun to notice things she had trained herself not to notice. The way his hands moved when he spoke of his tenants, precise and grounded. The hands of a man who had been taught from boyhood that a title was a responsibility and not a prize. The way he listened, which was not the way most men listened. He did not wait for her to stop speaking. He waited for her to finish speaking, which was a different thing, and he asked questions afterward that proved he had heard her. The way his jaw tightened, just once, when she mentioned her father, and the way he let the subject pass without comment when he saw that she did not wish to follow it. He was not, she realized, a man who had changed. He was a man who had been unmasked, who had, by whatever slow and painful process, shed the reserve he had worn in London, and who was showing her, one Thursday at a time, the person he had always been underneath it. She did not know whether to be grateful or afraid. She was both. On the 7th visit, it snowed so heavily that he could not ride back. He had sent his carriage home at the gate, as he always did, and when the hour ended and she opened the door to let him go, she found that the world had been buried while they drank their tea. The lane was gone. The birches were gone. The path she had shoveled that morning was under a foot of new snow. The gray mare stood at the gate with her head down, patient and miserable. And Julian Hartley, who had ridden 40 miles through a storm without thinking, stood in her doorway and looked at the weather and then looked at her, and she saw him calculate, very quickly, the cost of what he was about to say. "I will sleep in the stable," he said. "You will do no such thing. Eloise, there is a room at the back. It belonged to Mrs. Finch's nephew when he stayed. The bed is not made, but the sheets are clean. Mrs. Finch will make it up. You will sleep there, and you will leave at first light. And if anyone learns of it, I will tell them plainly that the Duke of Ashcombe was caught in a storm at my gate, and that I would not have him freeze for the sake of gossip. I am past caring what gossip says of me. You are not past caring. I am past letting it govern me. It is a different thing." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded, and he stepped back into the parlor, and Mrs. Finch, who had been hovering in the kitchen doorway with an expression Eloise chose not to interpret, went to prepare the back room without being asked. Eloise added another log to the fire. Julian sat in what had become, by silent agreement, his chair. And for the first time since the first snowfall, they sat together in the cottage past the hour she had granted, and neither of them spoke of it, and neither of them moved. "Tell me," he said after a while. His voice was very low. The fire was the only sound. "Tell me how you came to this place. I have not asked. I did not want to press. But I have thought of it every day for a fortnight, and I cannot bear my own speculation any longer." She did not answer at once. She looked into the fire. She thought of all the ways she had refused to tell this story, even to herself. She thought of the woman she had been when she had left Grosvenor Square in the early coach with a single trunk and a letter of introduction to a cousin of her mother's in Harrow who had agreed, reluctantly, to let her a cottage for a sum she could almost afford. She thought of the first night she had slept under this roof, alone for the first time in her life, with the wind in the birches and the taste of August lilies still somewhere in the back of her throat. She thought of the letter she had written and not sent, the one she had burned in this very grate 3 days after arriving, because she had understood that if she sent it, she would have no pride left to stand on. "I came here," she said slowly, "because I could not bear to be looked at. Lady Penrose was kind. She would have kept me. But everyone in her house had seen my face in the garden at Richmond, and they would have watched me to see how I bore it, and I could not have borne being watched. So I left. I took my mother's money, which was not much, and I asked Lady Penrose's cousin if he had a cottage to let, and he did, and I came here. And I taught myself, Julian, I taught myself very carefully, how to live as though none of it had happened. I read. I walked. I kept a journal. I did not write to anyone. I did not answer anyone. I returned your letters because I had made myself a rule that I would not read them, and I kept the rule for 2 years, and I was proud of it, and I was wrong." "Why were you wrong?" She looked at him. The fire painted half of his face in gold and left the other half in a shadow she had begun to know too well. "Because the rule was not keeping me safe," she said. "It was only keeping me from having to decide. And this morning, the morning I wrote on the envelope, I realized that I had been deciding all along. I had been deciding to wait. I had been deciding to sit in a small room and let the years go by, because if I sat still long enough, eventually one of two things would happen. Either I would stop feeling anything, or you would come." He did not speak. She did not look at him. "And I do not know, Julian," she went on, very quietly. "I do not know which of those things I was hoping for. I still do not know. And that is why I cannot give you an answer. Not because I do not love you, but because I do, and I am frightened of what it will cost me to admit it." She had said it. She had not meant T5000 say it. The word had slipped out of her like a hinge giving way, and she heard it land in the quiet room, and she did not look up, because she could not bear to see his face in the moment he understood what she had just told him. For a long time, he did not move. And then, very slowly, he rose from his chair and crossed the small parlor and knelt down beside hers. And he did not touch her, but his face was level with hers at last, and when she finally lifted her eyes to meet his, she saw that he was weeping. Not loudly, not performatively, only 2 slow tears that had escaped him without his permission, and which he did not bother to wipe away. "Eloise," he said, "I love you. I have loved you from the first night I heard you speak. I did not know how to say it then, and I have been saying it wrongly ever since, and I am saying it now in your parlor at midnight, in a snowstorm, on my knees, which is the only place from which a man like me has any right to say it at all. And I am asking you not to marry me. Not yet. Not today. I am asking you only to let me say it without returning it to me across an envelope. She reached out. She touched his face, the side the fire did not light, and she felt the wet line on his cheek under her thumb. She did not speak. She did not have to. He closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against her knee, and for a long time the fire was the only sound in the room, and the snow fell outside the window, and the world was very small and very quiet, and, for the first time in 2 years, entirely enough. He left in the morning. The snow had stopped before dawn, and by the time the sun cleared the birches the lane was passable again, and Julian rose from the narrow bed in the back room and came down to find Eloise already awake at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea between them. They did not speak of what had passed by the fire. They did not need to. He drank his tea, and she drank hers, and when he stood to go he took her hand for the first time in 2 years and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and she let him, and neither of them said a word. He was in the saddle within the quarter hour. She stood at the gate to watch him ride away, and she did not weep this time, and she did not feel empty when he was gone. She felt, instead, the strange new steadiness of a woman who had finally put down a thing she had been carrying too long. She thought, as she walked back to the cottage through the fresh snow, that perhaps this was what mending felt like. Not the absence of pain, but the absence of pretending there was none. The mending lasted 11 days. On the 12th day, a carriage turned into Harrow Lane that had no business being there. It was a town carriage, black lacquered and unmarked, and the horses that drew it were a matched pair of blacks that had not been bred for country roads. Mrs. Finch saw it first from the kitchen window. She came into the parlor with her apron twisted in her hands, and she said, in a voice that was not quite her own, that there was a lady at the gate who had not been invited. Eloise rose. She went to the window. She looked down the lane, and she saw, stepping out of the carriage with the careful disdain of a woman who had never in her life been in a place she considered beneath her, the Dowager Duchess of Ashcombe, Julian's mother. Eloise stood very still at the window for a long moment. She had never met the Dowager. She had seen her across a ballroom twice, and once at a distance in Hyde Park, and she knew the shape of her only from the coldness of it. The Dowager was a small woman. She had always been small. It was one of the things people said about her, that she was smaller than her voice, smaller than her rank, smaller than the fear she inspired in her own household. She wore a pelisse of deep charcoal and a bonnet trimmed with black ribbon, and she walked up the shoveled path to the cottage door as though she had rehearsed every step of it in the carriage. Mrs. Finch, Eloise said quietly, bring the good tea. Not the everyday. The caddy at the back of the shelf. Ma'am, are you certain? And set out 3 cups. She will have brought a companion. She will not acknowledge her, but she has brought one, and I will not have the woman standing in my hallway without so much as a chair. She had. A thin woman of middle years in a plain brown dress followed 2 paces behind the Dowager up the path, a lady's maid or a cousin, it did not matter which. Eloise smoothed her hair with the flat of her palm. She pinched her cheeks once. She straightened the shawl across her shoulders. She opened the door before the Dowager had raised her hand to knock. Your Grace, she said. She curtsied. It was not a deep curtsy, but it was a correct one, and the Dowager's eyes marked it. Miss Merritt. The voice was dry and small and precisely pitched. I am aware that I have not been invited. I do not intend to stay long. May I come in? Of course. She brought them into the parlor. She seated the Dowager in the chair by the fire, which was Julian's chair, and she did not know whether the Dowager had chosen it deliberately or by chance, and she did not allow herself to consider the question. Mrs. Finch brought the tea on the good silver tray, which had been Eloise's mother's, and which had not been out of its cupboard in 2 years. The companion did not sit. She stood by the door with her hands folded and her eyes lowered, and she might as well have been a piece of furniture for all the Dowager acknowledged her. Eloise poured. Her hands were steady. She had decided, somewhere between the window and the door, that she would not give this woman the satisfaction of a tremor. Will you take milk, Your Grace? I will not, thank you. I do not intend to drink it. I intend only to look at the cup, which is an old trick of mine, and which keeps my hands occupied while I say what I have come to say." The Dowager folded her gloved hands in her lap. "I will be brief. My son has ridden to this cottage 6 times in a fortnight. I have it on the authority of his valet, who is loyal to me, and on the authority of the innkeeper at Barnet, who is loyal to money. My son believes himself to be in love with you. He believed the same thing 2 years ago. He is a man of steady affections and poor judgment, and those are not qualities that serve well together. Your Grace, I have not finished. You will have your turn. My son has also, I am told, remained under this roof overnight during a storm. I do not accuse you of impropriety. I am not a fool, and I know my son, and I know that if anything improper had occurred, he would already have been at his solicitor's writing a settlement. I accuse you of something worse than impropriety, Miss Merritt. I accuse you of not sending him home." Eloise set down her cup. She felt, somewhere beneath her ribs, the old familiar cold, the one she had not felt since the garden at Richmond. But she did not look away. "Your Grace," she said, "I have sent your son home every Thursday for a month, and he has returned every Thursday for a month, and you have opened the door." "I have." "Then you have not sent him home." "I have not closed the door against him." "It is not the same thing." The Dowager's mouth moved, very slightly. It might have been the beginning of a smile. It was not a warm one. "You are quick," she said. "I had heard you were. It was part of what troubled me. Let me be plain with you, Miss Merritt. My son will not marry you. I have not asked him to. He will ask you. He has already begun to ask you, in whatever careful and cowardly manner he has chosen this time, and you will not be able to refuse him because you do not wish to, and you will ruin him, and he will let you, and it will not be your fault, and it will not be his fault, and I will nonetheless spend the remainder of my life watching my son preside over an estate that has been closed to him by every house of consequence in England. His sister will not make a match. The political work of 4 generations will be undone, and he will tell himself, because he is his father's son and a romantic in spite of all my efforts, that it was worth it because he was happy. Do you understand me?" "I understand you." "Then you understand what I am asking." "I understand what you are asking, Your Grace. I do not understand why you believe I will grant it." The Dowager tilted her head a quarter inch. "Because you have refused him before. Because you left London rather than stay and fight for him 2 years ago, which tells me you are not without pride, and it tells me you are not without sense. I am appealing to the woman who left. I am not appealing to the woman who has opened her door for a month. I do not think that woman will hear me." "You are correct," Eloise said quietly. "She will not." The Dowager's eyes narrowed. It was the first sign Eloise had seen that the old woman had not expected this answer. "Your Grace," Eloise said. She kept her hands in her lap. She kept her voice very even. 2 years ago I was 23 and frightened, and I left London because I believed that a man who would not speak for me in a garden would never speak for me in a drawing-room, and I did not wish to be the woman who waited to find out. I was wrong about him. I was not wrong about myself. I would have been destroyed by that waiting. So I left, and I built a life in this cottage that was small and quiet and mine, and it was not a life, Your Grace, not in any way that matters, but it taught me something you may not have considered. It taught me that I am capable of refusing the thing I want. I refused your son for 2 years. I refused him from this very chair. I refused him across every envelope he sent me. And I refused him because I believed, at the bottom of everything, that he had not truly wanted me enough to be ruined for me. I believed it was a fondness. I believed it was a season's affection. I believed he would recover and marry a Tollesbury or a Penrose or any one of a dozen suitable women, and that I would be a thing he remembered fondly and did not regret. And I was wrong. I know I was wrong because he rode 40 miles through a snowstorm to ask me a question I had not answered. I know I was wrong because he has come to this cottage 6 times in a fortnight and never once asked for anything I was not ready to give. I know I was wrong, Your Grace, because the man your son has become in 2 years is not a man who recovers. He is a man who waits, and I will not insult him by refusing him a second time out of a fear I have already outgrown." The Dowager did not speak for a long moment. The fire cracked. The companion at the door did not move. When the Dowager finally spoke, her voice was lower than it had been. "You are prepared to be hated, then. I am prepared to be spoken of. It is not the same. No, but I have been spoken of before. I was spoken of the morning after Richmond. I have already been the woman at the edge of a ballroom, whom 300 people looked away from at once. I survived it, Your Grace. I did not enjoy it, but I discovered that I could bear it. And a person who has discovered she can bear a thing is not easily frightened by the prospect of bearing it again. His sister, Your Grace, is 17 years old and, by his account, the brightest and most sensible person in his family. I do not believe Henrietta will be ruined by a sister-in-law she has not yet met. I believe, in fact, that if she is half the young woman her brother describes, she will make her own way, and she will do it better than either of us gives her credit for. The Dowager closed her eyes briefly. It was a gesture so small that Eloise almost missed it. When she opened them again, something in her face had shifted. Not softened, precisely. Eloise did not flatter herself, but changed. You love him. I do. You did not say it in a letter. No. I said it in this room, to him, 3 nights ago, at midnight, by that fire. I do not owe you the same telling, Your Grace, but I will give it to you because I will not have you leave this cottage believing that I am a schemer or a fool. I love your son. I have loved him from the first night we spoke. I left him because I was afraid of what that love would cost me. I will not leave him a second time for the same reason. If he asks me, I will have him. If he does not ask me, I will still have loved him, and I will still be glad of it, and I will live out the rest of my days in this cottage or another, and I will not write to you, and I will not trouble you. But I will not give him up to save you the trouble of a season's gossip. I owe him better than that. I owe myself better than that. And I suspect, Your Grace, that you know it. The Dowager looked down at the untouched cup in her hands. She looked at it for a long time. When she set it down carefully, as though the cup were an old thing and she were sorry to disturb it. I did not come here to be persuaded, she said. Her voice was quieter now, and drier, and something underneath it had cracked a little. I came here to persuade. It has been many years since anyone has turned a conversation of mine back upon me. My son has never done it. My husband, when he was living, did not do it. You have done it in the space of 1 cup of tea. I did not mean to be disrespectful. Do not apologize. I am not scolding you. I am, against every expectation with which I arrived at your gate, in something very near to admiration. The Dowager rose. She adjusted her gloves. The companion at the door straightened by instinct. I will not give you my blessing today, Miss Merritt. I am not ready to give it. I may never be. But I will say this to you, which I will not say again, and which I ask you not to repeat. I love my husband. We were not a love match when we married. We became one, which is a different and rarer thing. And when he died, I was not prepared for what it would do to me. I have spent 9 years managing my son's life because it was the only life I still had any power over, and I have been wrong to do it, and I have known I have been wrong to do it, and I have not known how to stop. If my son is found, in a cottage at the end of a lane in Harrow, the thing I found too late and kept too briefly, then I will not be the one to take it from him. I will not celebrate it. I will not attend the wedding unless he begs me, and he will not beg me, but I will not stand in the way. She turned. She walked to the door. The companion moved aside. The Dowager paused with her gloved hand on the latch, and she turned her head a quarter of the way back, and she did not quite look at Eloise. Tell him I came. I will. Tell him I was not gentle. I will not need to. He will know. The Dowager almost smiled. It was a very small thing. And then she went out to her carriage, and the companion followed, and within 3 minutes the black-lacquered carriage had turned at the end of the lane and was gone. Eloise stood in the parlor with the fire burning and the second cup of tea still warming between her hands, and she did not move for some time. She was waiting, she realized, for her hands to begin trembling. They did not. She sat down. She drank the tea. It was good tea. She had been saving it. Julian came the next Thursday, as he had said he would, and she told him. She told him plainly and without flourish, in the parlor, with the door closed and Mrs. Finch elsewhere. She told him what his mother had said and what she had answered. She did not soften it. She did not embellish it. She watched his face as she spoke, and she saw the muscle in his jaw work once and then still, and she saw him understand, by the time she had finished, that she had fought his mother for him and had not come to him for permission afterward. He did not speak for a long time. When he did speak, his voice was very low. You should not have had to. I was going to, Julian, whether you liked it or not. It was my conversation. She did not come to see you. She came because of me. She came because she is a frightened woman who has confused fear with duty for so long that she can no longer tell them apart. I am sorry for her. I am not sorry, I answered her. He looked down at his hands. He turned them over and turned them back, and then he raised his eyes and said, "Will you marry me, Eloise?" She did not move. "I had meant," he said, "to ask you in the spring. I had meant to take you to Ashcombe first and let you see the house and decide for yourself whether you could bear to live in it. I had meant to give you more time. But I find, Eloise, that I cannot bear another hour of not having asked. I find that I have spent 2 years not asking, and the cost has been immense, and I will not let an afternoon pass without asking the question that I have owed you for 2.5 years. Will you marry me?" She was crying. She had not meant to. She did not bother to stop. "Yes." He closed his eyes. He did not move for a moment. Then he crossed the room, and this time he did not kneel, and this time he did touch her, and he took her face between his hands, and he kissed her for the first time since the garden at Richmond, and it was not the kiss of the garden. The garden had been 2 young people at the edge of a possibility. This was 2 people who had walked through 2 years of silence to find each other again, and it tasted of that. It was slower. It was more certain. It was the kiss of a man who had already lost her once and had no intention of losing her a second time, and she felt, beneath it, the whole of what they had both survived to reach this moment. When she could speak again, she said, "I do not want a London wedding. I did not propose a London wedding. I want it here, in the village church. I want the banns read the usual way. I want Mrs. Finch to be there, and Henrietta if she will come, and I do not want 300 people staring at me as though I were a scandal they had paid admission to see. Then we will have it here, in the village church, with the banns read the usual way. Your mother will not come. No, she told you she would not. I believe her. I am sorry. Do not be. I am not. I have been my mother's son for 32 years. I will be your husband for the rest of them. I know which I would rather be." The weeks that followed were the strangest of Eloise's life, not because anything extraordinary happened in them, but because nothing did. The banns were read. The village baker's wife came to the cottage with a basket of sweet rolls and congratulations, and did not even pretend to hide her curiosity, and Eloise loved her for it. The vicar, who was an elderly man with shaking hands and very kind eyes, came to tea and spoke of the scripture readings and of the flowers and of nothing else at all, as though he had married a duke to a village tenant every Tuesday of his working life. Julian rode over from Ashcombe most afternoons. Sometimes he stayed for tea. Sometimes he only came to the gate, and they walked the lane together to the copse of birches and back, and he spoke of the estate and of his sister and of the small, ordinary matters of a life he was preparing to share with her. She began to understand, in those weeks, that she had been loved not only in the grand and terrible way of a proposal in a parlor, but in the small and constant way of a man who wished to know what she thought about his tenants' roofs. The second was, she found, the more difficult to refuse. It was also, she discovered, the deeper. They were married on a Tuesday in March, in a small stone church at the edge of the village of Harrow, under a sky that had finally begun to give up the winter. Eloise wore a pale gray gown trimmed with cream. She had not bought it new. She had altered an old gown of her mother's that she had been keeping in the bottom of a trunk, and when Julian saw her walk up the aisle in it, he did not say anything, but the expression on his face was the one she would remember for the rest of her life, and she thought, watching him watch her, that there was no silk in London that could have bought her that particular look. Mrs. Finch wept through the service. Lady Henrietta Hartley, aged 17, stood as a witness beside her brother with her chin lifted and her eyes bright, and she embraced Eloise afterward with a fierce, quick grip and whispered into her ear that she had wanted a sister since she was 9, and she had been beginning to despair. Lady Penrose came from London. She had not been told in time to refuse. She stood at the back of the church and wept quietly, and when the service was over she crossed to Eloise and took her hand and said, in a voice almost too low to be heard, that she had known. From the first night in Grosvenor Square, she had known. She had only not known that it would take this long. The Dowager did not come. Julian did not speak of it. Eloise did not press him. But on the morning of the wedding, a package had arrived at the cottage by private messenger. Inside, wrapped in silk, was a small string of pearls that had belonged to Julian's grandmother. There was no note. Eloise did not need one. She wore the pearls to the church. She wore them to the wedding breakfast. She wore them that evening when she and Julian sat for the first time in the small dining room at Ashcombe Court. She at one end of the long polished table, and he at the other, and she laughed aloud at the absurdity of the distance, and he laughed too, and moved his plate to the chair beside hers. And Henrietta, sitting opposite, said it was about time someone had the sense to do it. They stayed at Ashcombe for 3 weeks. Eloise learned the house a room at a time. She met the housekeeper and the steward and the chief gardener. She met the tenants, one family after another, and she did not pretend to be other than she was, and she did not pretend that she had been born to the rank she now held, and she discovered, to her quiet astonishment, that the tenants did not hold it against her. Some of them, she thought, perhaps preferred it. She sat in on the estate accounts at her husband's invitation. She read them. She asked questions. She made a suggestion, on the second week, about the drainage of a low field on the east boundary, and Julian looked up from the ledger with an expression of slow, delighted surprise, and said that he had been meaning to ask the steward the same thing for a year and had never got round to it. She wrote to her cousin in Hertfordshire, whom she had never met, and invited him to dine at Ashcombe the next time he was in London. He came. He was a nervous, courteous man of 40 who had not expected his entailed estate to come with the goodwill of the Merritt heir, and he left promising to look after her father's library, as though she had asked it of him in person. He had heard her. Within a month, 3 crates of her father's books arrived at Ashcombe by carriage. Julian had a shelf built for them in the small library off the morning room, and they stood there in the alphabet her father had taught her, and she cried when she saw them, and Julian did not pretend not to notice, and she was glad of it. On the 4th week, Lady Henrietta came to her in the conservatory with a letter in her hand. The letter was from the Dowager. It was very short. It said that the Dowager was prepared to receive her son and his wife at the Dower House at a time of their choosing, and that she would not promise to be gracious, but she would promise to be civil, which was, she wrote, the best she could offer at present and was more than she had offered the previous month, and she hoped that this would be understood. Eloise read the letter twice. She handed it back to Henrietta. "We will go on Thursday," she said. "Are you sure?" "I am sure, Henny. Thursday has always been our day." They went on Thursday. The Dowager received them in her small drawing room at the Dower House. She did not rise. She did not smile. She offered tea, and she spoke of the weather, and she spoke of the lambs in the north pasture, and she did not speak of the wedding or of the cottage or of the afternoon in Harrow Lane. At the end of the hour, she rose. She walked Eloise to the door herself, which she had not walked her son, and at the door she paused and looked at her daughter-in-law for a long moment and said, very quietly, "The pearls suit you." "Thank you, Your Grace. You may call me Adelaide, if you choose." "I will, Your Grace. In time." The Dowager almost smiled. In time, then. They went on Thursdays after that, for a long while, and then on Tuesdays as well, and then on whatever days the weather and the estate permitted, and Eloise did not become the Dowager's friend, not precisely, because the Dowager had never been a woman who permitted friendship, but she became something else. She became the person the Dowager asked to read aloud to her, in later years, when her eyes had begun to fail and her pride would not permit her to ask her son. She became the person the Dowager wrote to, in small, correct notes, when she had an opinion she wished delivered without the trouble of delivering it herself. And she became, at the last, the person who sat with the Dowager through the final fortnight of an illness that neither of them had expected to come so soon, and who closed her eyes, and who afterward held Julian while he wept for a mother he had never entirely known how to love and who, in the end, had loved him more than she had known how to say. But that was years later. In the spring of their first year, Eloise stood at the window of the small library at Ashcombe with a letter in her hand and a candle burning on the sill, though the sun was still up and the candle was not needed, and she did not know why she had lit it except that the light felt like something she wished to offer to the room. The letter was from Lady Penrose. It said, in the generous hand of a woman who had been waiting 2 years to say it, that half of London had been shocked by the marriage, and the other half had pretended not to be, and that Eloise had been the subject of exactly the conversation she had always dreaded, and that none of it had mattered, because the Duke of Ashcombe had written personally to every house of consequence in Mayfair to announce his marriage and to invite any who objected to call upon him in person, and none of them had called, and the matter had been settled in a fortnight, and Eloise was not a scandal. She was a duchess. It was, Lady Penrose wrote, a considerable difference. And then, in a postscript that Eloise read 3 times before she understood what it meant, Lady Penrose added that Lady Cordelia Tollesbury, who had long since married her baronet and had borne him 2 children, had sent a note to be forwarded. The note had been short. It had said only that Lady Cordelia had never held Eloise responsible for anything, and that she wished her every happiness, and that she hoped Eloise would not be troubled by the old affair in the garden at Richmond, because she herself had never been. She had added, at the very end, that she had always thought Ashcombe had been a fool, and she was glad to see that he had stopped being one. Eloise folded the letter. She did not weep. She had done with weeping, for the most part, that year. She stood at the window and looked down across the park to the small stand of birches at the edge of the formal gardens, which Julian had ordered planted because she had said, once, in passing, that the birches at the end of Harrow Lane had been the first thing about the cottage she had loved. He had remembered. He remembered everything. It was the quietest and most devastating thing about him. She had come to rely upon it the way one relies upon a floor beneath one's feet. He found her there. He always found her. He came into the library without announcement, which was a courtesy she had granted him in the first month and which he had never abused, and he stood behind her at the window and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him without turning. Lady Penrose writes that we are no longer a scandal, she said. I am sorry to hear it. Are you? A little. I had grown rather fond of being a scandal. It suited me. She laughed. She turned in his arms. She looked up at him, at the man she had refused for 2 years and accepted in one winter and married in the spring, and she thought, with the quiet wonder of a woman who had stopped expecting wonder some time ago, that she was not afraid anymore. Not of the ton, not of his mother, not of her own love, not of any of it. Julian. Yes. Do you remember the first letter you sent me? The one I returned with the note on the front. I remember it. What did it say? I never read it. He was quiet for a moment. I know. Will you tell me now? He thought. He did not answer at once. And then he said, very simply, it said that I had been wrong. That I had been wrong for 2 years. That I did not expect forgiveness and did not ask for it. But that I could not go into another winter without having said, at least once and plainly, that I loved you, and that I had always loved you, and that if I never heard from you again, I would nonetheless live the rest of my life as a man who had loved you. That was all it said. It was not a good letter. I wrote it 4 times. She reached up. She touched his face. The side the candle did not light, which had been her habit since the first night he had knelt beside her chair in the cottage on Harrow Lane. Julian. Yes. We both knew that was the truth. He smiled. It was the small, slow, quiet smile she had first drawn out of him in a ballroom in Grosvenor Square when she had asked him whether he ever spoke in drawing rooms. And it was a smile she had seen, now, in 100 rooms and at 100 tables, and she would see it in 100 more, and it would never stop being the smile that had first told her who he was underneath the reserve. He leaned down. He pressed his forehead against hers. Outside, the birches that were not yet tall enough to call birches swayed in the March wind, and the letter in her hand smelled faintly of the rose water Lady Penrose had used on her stationery since before Eloise had been born, and the candle on the sill burned steadily though it was not needed, and the world, which had once seemed to her so narrow and so final, had opened again into something she had not known how to believe in. I know, he said. She closed her eyes. I have always known, he said. It is why I came. They stood that way for a long time, at the window in the small library, with the letter between them and the candle burning and the park stretching out below them in the pale gold of a March afternoon. Eloise thought, because she had trained herself over 2 years of solitude to mark her own thoughts carefully, that she ought to feel triumphant. The ton had bent. The Dowager had bent. The woman who had once stood in a garden in Richmond and heard her own ruin announced by someone else's mother was now a duchess standing at the window of her own house, loved and married and believed. It was a vindication. Any novelist would have called it one. But she did not feel triumphant. She felt, instead, the opposite of triumph, which was not defeat but something calmer, something that sat further back in the chest, something very near to peace. She had not won. She had simply stopped running. And the world, which had seemed for 2 years to be a machine designed to grind her down, had turned out in the end to be made of people, and most of those people had meant her no particular harm, and some of them had loved her all along, and some of them had learned to love her by being given the chance. She thought of the cottage. She still thought of it often. Julian had not sold it. She had asked him not to, and he had understood without requiring her to explain, and the little house at the end of Harrow Lane remained theirs, kept by a tenant who paid a nominal rent and who had been instructed to keep the front parlor empty of new furniture and the shelf of books untouched. They went there sometimes. Not often. Once or twice a year. They would drive down in the small carriage, and they would sit by the fire, and Eloise would make tea with her own hands in the kitchen where she had made it for 2 years alone, and Julian would sit in the chair that had been his from the beginning, and they would say very little, and they would come away steadied. She had explained this to Henrietta once, in the conservatory, when Henrietta had asked her, with the frank curiosity of a girl of 18 who had begun to suspect that marriage was more complicated than the novel suggested, why they went back at all. Because that was where I became myself, Eloise had said. The cottage, not the ballroom, not the garden, not even Ashcombe. I built myself in that parlor, Henny. I built myself out of 2 years of silence and a returned letter and one conversation at midnight by the fire. If I forget it, I forget who I am. And I have no intention of forgetting who I am, even for your brother. Especially not for your brother. He would not want me to. Henrietta had looked at her for a long moment, with the serious eyes that ran in the Hartley line, and had nodded once, and had said, "Then I should like to build myself somewhere too. Someday, before I marry anyone." "Yes," Eloise had said, "you should." And so it was that when Henrietta, at 19, turned down her third proposal in a single season and announced that she would not marry until she was 25, and that she would spend the interval at Ashcombe with her sister learning the accounts and reading the tenants' letters, the Dowager did not protest. Eloise suspected, though she could not prove it, that the Dowager had come to some private accommodation with her own history. The Dowager did not say so. The Dowager did not say much of anything about the matter. But she wrote to Henrietta every week after that, and she sent her books, and she did not once suggest that the girl was throwing her life away. It was enough. Years passed. The 2nd year brought a daughter, and the 4th brought a son, and the 7th brought another daughter, and the cottage at the end of Harrow Lane became a place the children begged to visit, because it was small and strange and theirs, and because their mother made the tea herself there, and because in the parlor there was a chair that was no one's and everyone's, and because on the mantel above the fire there hung a badly painted watercolor of a field in Hertfordshire in summer, which their mother had painted when she was 15, and which she said was the worst painting in any house either of their parents owned, and which their father said was the best painting in any house he had ever walked into. And Eloise, watching her children chase each other through the narrow lane between the birches one summer afternoon in the 12th year of her marriage, with Julian beside her leaning against the gate, thought of the woman who had stood at that same gate in the first snow of December, holding a letter she had not read, and deciding, with the quiet finality of someone who had run out of patience, to write 8 words across the front of it. She thought of how much had depended on those 8 words. She thought of how nearly she had not written them. She reached out. She took Julian's hand. "What?" he said. "Nothing. Only thinking. About the letter. The first one. The one I returned." He smiled. The slow, quiet smile. "You always think of it here." "I know. Does it still hurt?" "No. It has not hurt in years. It only reminds me." "Of what?" She looked at him. The sun was behind him. The birches, full-grown now, cast long shadows across the lane. The youngest child was laughing somewhere in the copse. The world, which had once been a small and frightened parlor with a single candle, had become this. All of this. "Of how close I came," she said, "to being the woman who did not write it." He drew her hand to his lips. He kissed her knuckles, as he had the morning after the storm, as he had 1,000 mornings since, as he would, she knew, for as many mornings as they had left between them. "You were never that woman," he said. "Even when you thought you were. I knew you were not. It is why I came." She leaned against him. The light moved through the birches. The children called to each other in voices that carried on the summer air, and the quiet that she had once built around herself as a shelter, and that she had once feared she would never leave, settled around them both, in the lane, at the end of the world she had made, full at last of all the things she had not known how to believe in. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.